So which film simulation performs best in low light with high ISO values? I tested all of the film simulations on an XT4, and today I'm going to show you what I found. Hi everyone, and welcome to Pal the Tech. Today we are talking about Fujifilm film simulations, specifically comparing what happens to different film sims when you start to crank up the ISO. For those of you new to Fujifilm or photography in general, whenever you increase the camera's ISO value, you are amplifying the electrical charge from light photons that hit your camera's sensor. And so if you're out somewhere taking photos with not a lot of light, increasing the ISO is one of the 3 exposure triangle settings that allows you to capture more light in your image. If you want to know more about how ISO works, be sure to check out my video on it. Now, we all know and love the Fujifilm film simulations. With the touch of a button, you can apply some wonderful Fujifilm specific looks to your photos. If you're shooting JPEG images with your camera, the film simulations are permanently baked into those JPEG files. If you're shooting in RAW format, you're going to be required to add the film simulation later on in post-production. Because RAW files allow for post-production changes to film simulations later on, I'm not going to be using them in today's video. Instead, we are going to be using the straight out of camera JPEGs. I shot them all on this XT4 using the 35mm f2.0 lens with identical lighting conditions and settings for each shot. I also zeroed out the additional in-camera image quality settings such as sharpness, clarity, and so forth. I tested each of the 12 main film simulations at the following ISO values: 1600, 3200, 6400, and 12,800. Those are all the native ISO values for the camera. In addition, I tested 2 additional ISO values of 25,600 and 51,200. Now, those are called extended or simulated ISO values, and they are applied digitally to your already shot image before your camera saves it to the SD card. So here's what I wanted to find out. Is there a difference between film simulations in how they handle high ISO values? Are some film sims better than others? And if they start to fall apart at higher ISOs, which one is the worst? Which ones perform the best? And so forth. Now, I'm not going to go through an in-depth comparison of every single film sim against each ISO value, against each other, and so forth. If I did that, they would have to put a warning label on this video to not watch while operating heavy machinery or driving. So instead, let's look at a few brief highlights and I'll share with you my results. First off, in ISO values below 1600, these film simulations all performed pretty much the same. For example, here's Provia versus Acros at ISO 160, and they both have about the same amount of noise. However, once you get to ISO 1600, we can start to see some differences. Now, to be clear, you need to be looking at the images at around 200 to 300% to see it. For example, right here at 300%, you can see that Provia does a bit better than Classic Negative, and it's just a tiny bit better. However, it's virtually identical to Pro Negative Standard and ETERNA. So basically, at ISO 1600, you really need to crank up the pixel peeping to about 300% to see much difference. And when you do, the overall winners at this ISO are Provia, Pro Negative Standard, and Monochrome. Now, Monochrome is interesting because the other black and white film simulation, Acros, looks noticeably worse. In fact, both Acros and Bleach Bypass were the worst performers at this ISO range. Next, I tested at both 3200 ISO and 6400 ISO. This is Provia on the left, Classic Negative on the right. The worst performers were Classic Negative, Bleach Bypass, and Acros. And if you notice here, Monochrome holds up very well against Pro Negative Standard at 3200 ISO. Look at that, they look identical at 400%. Velvia starts to show more noise than Pro Negative Standard. Now, at the 6400 ISO range, all film simulations are affected pretty much the same as at the 3200 ISO range. And just like at 3200 ISO, the worst performers at 6400 ISO were Classic Negative, Bleach Bypass, and Acros. And lastly, I tested at 25,600 and 51,200 extended ISO. Again, Pro Negative Standard and Monochrome are the winners, with Bleach Bypass and Acros performing the worst. And at 51,200 ISO, it's pretty obvious which one has more noise. Acros really shows the noise at this level. Another thing I found interesting was that once you get up to these really high ISO values, Provia starts to show more noise, whereas ETERNA still looks good. Here's Provia versus ETERNA at 25,600 ISO. Clearly, ETERNA has less noise. Here's Acros versus Monochrome at 400% with 25,600 ISO. And here it is at 100%. And looking at Astia, you can clearly see that ETERNA has less noise at 25,600 ISO. And here's Astia versus Sepia. So there's some important takeaways from this. The first is that Monochrome is much less noisy than Acros. In going through my testing, it seems pretty conclusive that Fujifilm adds some additional grain and/or noise to Acros to give it that look. The problem is that at higher ISO values, it starts to fall apart. So if you're planning on shooting with Acros, I would not go above 3200 ISO. Also, I would definitely make sure that the grain setting on the back of your camera is turned off. However, keep in mind that if you're going after a specific look, you may want to have that added noise and grain. And if that's the case, Acros definitely has you covered. Now, Provia, Velvia, Astia, Monochrome, Classic Chrome, ETERNA, Pro Negative Standard, and Sepia all performed well and had roughly the same good performance at higher ISO values. If you're shooting at ISO 3200 and above, I would avoid Bleach Bypass, Acros, and Classic Negative. Once you get above ISO 6400, I would not use any of those three film sims if I wanted to keep my noise to a minimum. Most interesting of all was the winner, and what I found was that Pro Negative Standard and ETERNA outperformed even Provia at the ISO ranges that I tested. So if you're planning on shooting in low light at high ISO values, you may want to give Pro Negative Standard or ETERNA a try. It gave me the best overall and consistent results. Something that bears mentioning, ISO does not actually create noise. It merely amplifies the noise that's already in your image. If you want to reduce noise in your images, whenever possible, consider always adding more light to your scene instead of relying on simply increasing the ISO. Again, this is because your ISO settings are amplifying the noise that's already there to begin with. And remember, everything I told you in this video applies to the Fujifilm straight out of camera JPEGs. RAW files are manipulated in post-production and depend entirely on what RAW converter you end up using. But what about you? Are there any film simulations that you find either better or worse at high ISO ranges? If so, let us know in the comments down below. It'd be very interesting to see what you come up with. In the meantime, I hope you enjoyed the video and found it helpful. And if you did, be sure to give it the like and subscribe. I will see you very soon in another video. Take care.